Welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, March 19th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is provoking and waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. International polls show that it's the United States that is by far the most feared government in the world, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel. The wars the U.S. is waging in 8 countries, and its war provocations against Russia and China, risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, and Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged country at the end of World War II. It's unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for fascist coups in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income for Americans who have been made poor by generations of our government's wars. My guest today on Aware on the Air is James Manrique of it was Vote Champaign. Is that
yes,
what? Yeah.
VoteChampaign.org.
Okay.
The Champaign County Voters Alliance. It's a nonpartisan group. We don't endorse any candidates. The goal is just to increase voter turnout by as much as possible in Champaign County, because with higher voter turnout we can get closer to many of the things that you just mentioned. But yeah, so I'm with them. And,
Good.
so I guess the opinions today won't be directly like endorsements of the candidates, but I'll give just my personal opinions on them and where I see some of the issues in the election currently.
Well, my experience, James, is that you're widely informed on this situation, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it because my ignorance is without spot or wrinkle here, in spite of the fact I've been a Champaign resident for many years. I almost wondered if the city of Champaign was testing that old notion that suppose they gave an election and nobody came.
Exactly.
But then I read in this morning's paper that people are sending in ballots at a great rate.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if it's higher than the last rate or if they did a comparison. But yeah, I agree. There's a lot of just lack of awareness of the election. That's kind of why we started VoteChampaign.org, was to help encourage the awareness of these low turnout elections, such as the municipals and the primaries, where the county on average will probably have less than 20% turnout of the already registered voters. And then different precincts will even have different turnouts. So, some precincts have as low as 1%.
Wow.
Other precincts,
that's probably mine. Yeah,
maybe it's mainly the college ones that are like 1%.
Oh yes,
there's also a lot of other
sense,
precincts that are like 5 to 10%, which are more of the low income areas. And then it's interesting to see the comparison between those areas and the high income areas, like the country club. The precincts in Champaign, the city of Champaign, that have the country club are consistently the highest turnout precincts.
Interesting.
And then the precincts right around that are, in the top 10 consistently. So who turns up at the election determines the candidates. And
do you think there are more or fewer voters this year? I mean, the newspaper's headlines this morning says that there are a lot of mail-in ballots. What's the trend?
It will be really interesting to see how this year compares to 2017, because 2017 had the nursing home question on the ballot, and that was a big driver on both sides to get people out to the polls for the municipal election. So it'll be very interesting to see if this election will have similar drive, because I feel like that all the positions on the ballot are very important, but it doesn't seem like it has as much exposure as like the nursing home thing. But with 2018 was the highest turnout year for a midterm election in Champaign County. We broke all sorts of records, not with just like the turnout, but just with even those low turnout areas, the college areas they actually led in they were the highest turnout areas of that election, above the other high turnout, the high income areas.
Did you suppose some of this was due to excitement about national politics reflected locally, rather than response to local issues? People figured that.
I think it was all the above. I think it was like the national scene just putting a lot more exposure on there of that election, so that young people were a lot more aware that the election was actually happening. But then there was also a tremendous amount of local volunteer movement that was really targeting the campus crowd, and I think that combination of forces really helped increase that turnout.
Excuse my ignorance once again, but the election coming up, which is actually scheduled for
April 2nd.
For April 2nd? I see. They didn't want it April 1st. They made it April 2nd.
Yeah. Nobody would show up that day, I don't think.
Okay. Now, this is this Champaign County or just the city of Champaign?
Yeah, it's Champaign County. I think they call it a consolidated election. I think like back way long ago, it used to be like separate elections for each city.
Yes, I remember that actually.
But they've combined all the city elections into one election day, so it's like cheaper to run and everything.
When did that happen, that consolidation?
It might have been in the 70s or 80s. I'm not sure.
Oh, really? Oh, so not recently.
I think. I'm honestly not sure.
I'm still having trouble catching up. So, in fact, this election includes Champaign-Urbana and Champaign County.
Yep. There's a lot of small towns have contested elections. Like Ludlow has an election for village president.
Oh, yes. Well, we wouldn't want to miss that.
And those two guys live right across the street from each other. They're like 3 house numbers apart. So
oh, really?
It's very interesting, local politics.
And how many voters are there in Leadville?
I don't know. That's a good question. So
Twice as many as there are candidates.
So even though that there's like all these contested elections, with VoteChampaign.org, we just focus on Champaign, Urbana, Rantoul, and Mahomet, because those are the ones where we have volunteers at, and where it's like the biggest concentration of voters. So, but there are smaller towns that also have contested elections for like village trustees, school boards, all this sort of stuff. And then county-wide, everybody's voting on the Parkland Board of Trustees. That is a county-wide seat.
Okay.
So.
Are there other county-wide elections, or is Parkland Board of Trustees the only one?
Parkland Board's the only one. So that also is like a determination of turnout or whatever. Is that there's only the one county-wide thing. So turnout's kind of more dependent on how important people see the local races being.
Is former federal representative Tim Johnson part of that election for Parkland?
I don't think so, no.
I thought he was on that board, but I'm wrong.
He might be on the board, but he's not up for election this
I
time.
see, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me what you think are the interesting and or important elections out of this. We'll maybe start with the county. Is there anything else in the county that's
the
worth
county
looking at?
is just Parkland. Like I said, in the smaller areas, you got Arthur has a contested school board election where there's like 8 people running for 4 seats. Ludlow has that village president. Bonneville has something.
Now, are there issues here or just personalities?
For those small ones?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not very well versed on the very small ones.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
I'm not very well versed on what I guess are the larger ones here.
Exactly.
When we come to Champaign, what's going on in Champaign and what's
so Champaign's like one of the busiest ones of the county, because Champaign you have mayor, city council, and school board and park district are all contested.
Okay.
I guess that's the other thing with these elections is that there's also a lot of seats that are uncontested. Like in the smaller areas, they elect like librarian positions, like librarian trustees, and a lot of those are uncontested, where everybody's just filling the seats. But in Champaign, you have the mayor, city council, school board, and park district that are all contested.
Okay, let's hear about those. Start with the mayor and work up or down as you figure it.
So yeah, again, I'm not trying to endorse anybody one way or the other from Vote Champaign, but for the mayor, it's very interesting because you have 2 very different candidates for that. You have Deb Finan, which has been the mayor for a minute, I believe, and she's very good because, like, Champaign's been great with business, and I feel like Deb Finan has been very involved in like the business aspects of Champaign and trying to help businesses in Champaign. So she has a lot of skills in that regard. But there's an issue in Champaign right now. I don't know if you've heard about the housing situation. The fair housing for low income folks and the felony. What do you call it?
People who've been convicted of felonies.
Yeah, you're allowed to discriminate against them in Champaign, but not Urbana.
Interesting. I did hear something about that. So someone who has been judged guilty of a felony and served their time, so to speak, can be accommodated for housing in Urbana, but not in Champaign.
Yeah, and they can be accommodated in Champaign, but the landlord has the right to deny them based on the felony.
That alone.
Yeah, deny them the house, like the rental unit or whatever. They can just say, nope, I'm not going to rent to you because you have a felony. It doesn't matter what that felony was, whether it was something related to rental services or not.
I see.
But they can prohibit you just based on that felony.
Now, that's not at issue in Champaign. That is the difference between Champaign and Urbana.
Yeah, Champaign put that in. Urbana does not have that. So Urbana, you cannot deny somebody because they're a felon.
Now, and the mayor candidates have different opinions on that?
Yes. So currently there's, for 5 years after you get done serving your time, you can be denied housing for up to 5 years.
I see.
And so the people that are arguing against it say that any ban is going to be bad for recidivism. Because if you're trying to prevent people from going back to prison, one of the very first things that they need is stable housing. That seems like a no-brainer. You have to connect those two. And so banning them for 5 years is going to be a big waiting period.
Yeah.
Deb Finan has known about this issue for a while, and then when she was re-asked about it on the recent forum, the League of Women Voters hosted a forum, Deb Finan was asked about it again. She said she's willing to reconsider it. She's willing to possibly think about cutting the 5 years down to 3. And to me, that shows that she doesn't understand the recidivism problem. Because if she's talking about taking 5 down to 3, that's still not going to fix the problem with recidivism. So it depends on, so she's very much siding with the landlords on that situation. Whereas the other candidate, Azar Cobbs, he is very much in favor of getting rid of that. He talks a lot about it. He talks a lot to issues of communities of color in this town. So
this is a fairly charged issue, eh?
Yeah, and I don't know, the issue is weird because there's not a ton of data on it. It's hard to get data on who's actually been denied because they can be denied and nothing's really tracked. So that's one of the things that Deb Finan and others on her side continue to say is like, well, there's not a lot of data of people actually being denied, and what about the landlords? We have to think about them. But
are there other outstanding issues between the two mayor candidates?
Well, like I said, I think Deb's better with business because Azar Cobbs, unfortunately, he's been a candidate before in the past, and I'm not sure that he's like the most politically savvy. So it's kind of a toss-up if you want somebody that can really run the government well versus somebody that's really speaking to the issues. I don't know. So that's a hard election to try to parse out, I guess.
Can I ask who you're going to vote for? You don't have to tell me. It may not be not be a good idea if you're in the midst of the work you do.
But I mean, both candidates have their strengths for sure.
Let's come to the Champaign City Council. Some familiar faces and some unfamiliar ones there. Yeah,
the Champaign City Council is one of the most interesting ones because there's 8 candidates for 3 positions. 3 of those 8 candidates are currently on the board. I believe it's William Kiles, Matthew Gladney, and is it Christian? Oh, no, Tom Bruno. Yeah, Tom Bruno. They're all currently on the board. And the housing thing is a hot issue for the city council as well. I think Tom Bruno is unfortunately a little bit soft on that issue. He's more on the, let's have a study session and see what they say. Other candidates are much more, we need to get rid of it. It's a clear cut. If you're trying to end recidivism or if you're trying to lower recidivism, you got to get rid of it. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting candidates. I was really surprised with Michael Ledoux, because for whatever reason, I thought that he was kind of like a stuffy sort of candidate. Like, he's been in office for a long while.
He certainly has.
And I didn't really know what to think about him, but after seeing the candidate forum, he actually voted against that amendment back in the 90s. So this housing amendment was put into place in the 90s
He voted against the amendment that required.
that allows them to deny to felons. Because they had to specifically amend the law because they had like a fair housing thing where you
Right.
couldn't deny people based on
I see.
race, sex, gender, so many different reasons.
Previous conditions of servitude, so to speak.
Yeah, so it was a very wide encompassing fair housing thing that I think it was passed in the 70s if I'm not mistaken, and it was very wide. But in the 90s, they're like, we need to deny felons, we need to cut them out of that. And Michael Ledoux voted against that in the 90s when he was on the board. So that, to me, was pretty impressive. And then he has a big focus on poverty and stuff. Go ahead.
Other comments on city council candidates?
The other thing that makes the city council race very interesting is I feel that there's more than 3 very well qualified candidates because you're only voting for 3 out of those 8. But I feel like that there's more than 3 in those 8 that are very well qualified.
And
Like William Kyles, he speaks to the communities of color. He's big on those issues, and he's already on the board. So like he has that experience of the board or of the city council. Kenton
else?
Elmore is he's kind of like a fresh person to politics, so he can kind of give like a fresh, younger perspective on things, which is interesting. Andrew Christensen also has a lot of good perspective from where he's at. John Paul Yakim is also very interesting because he comes from a medical background, so he kind of provides a medical point of view on trying to get more medical access to low-income folks.
Interesting.
And he's already working on those issues in his free time. I think he might actually be a doctor. So there's a lot of really qualified candidates, but I do think on the housing thing there's a little bit of difference on that. And and then also just like as an individual voter, it's like, are you looking for younger, fresher faces? Are you looking for people that have been on the council for a while and you just want more of the same? So I think there's a lot of variety of choice there.
Champaign School Board, they up to 4 choices out of 9 candidates, right? And once again, are there issues of some importance here, or is this another personality conflict primarily?
Yeah, the school board is interesting because 2 of those 9 candidates don't really seem like real candidates. I think they filed, but they've been pretty much unable to be getting a hold of by the League of Women Voters, myself, and other people. So I'm not sure if they just filed to put their name in the hat or whatever.
Who are those 2?
Alicia Robinson and Sergio Gonzalez.
All right.
So there's basically no information on those folks.
Actually, if you go to the page that James is responsible for here, the votechampaign.org, which has a guide to these candidates, on the section on the school board, those 2 candidates don't have pictures, and I assume it was the candidates themselves who were responsible for getting their pictures on.
We asked the candidates for the pictures, but we also tried to just go through the internet and find pictures of anybody that we could.
Good. Anything important? Anything else important to say about that?
I guess so. The school board is interesting because, there's a lot of contention about, how to handle discipline issues in the school. There's a lot of people trying to change the way of, I guess, like the traditional method was just suspend the kid. Like if the kid acts up, just suspend him or send him to detention or whatever. And a big trend in schooling now is to try to, instead of just straight disciplining the child, trying to figure out what is causing this child to act up, and can we work on that rather than just discipline.
And there are some of these candidates who are particularly committed to that point of view?
Yeah, or just they have strong feelings on where that should go.
Okay.
And yeah, there's a few candidates that have already been on the board. I think Christopher Koppel, Kathy Shannon, Amy Armstrong, and maybe the Michael Fulmer, I think, might have all been on the board already. So I think Lee McDonald and Elizabeth and Jennifer Enoch are all the ones challenging them.
Recent discussions in Champaign on a school about and the Champaign School Board about construction and modifying the physical setting of Champaign schools. Those are essentially over, aren't they? I mean, that there are not any outstanding issues there. The work's being done, and things are happening in this regard, but the decisions are already made. Is that correct?
I think that's pretty much accurate. It's like most of those decisions have already been like made and are already in effect. I think there are still like tweaks that are happening to the plans, like as they get like later on in the phases, they've been making tweaks. Because sometimes like when they find out that they don't have quite enough budget, they have to like cut certain things. But that is definitely a contentious issue because I know that like a big part of that budget was building a new football field.
Yes.
I mean, that can be contentious for a variety of reasons.
Right,
Like
it certainly can.
Why put it into sports when you could be putting it into arts or civic education or just in general trying to help like the lower income students or just more teachers, because that's another issue with both school boards is class size. Class size in both Champaign and Urbana is way above state average and also above, way above what teacher foundations or teacher unions tend to recommend. I've heard like class sizes of like 25 or more students, which just sounds completely unmanageable, but I don't know.
In terms of the budget for Champaign schools, how much control does the school board have over that? Do they have some control over the income, the budget that comes to the school board, not just how to spend it, but how much they get?
That's a good question. I think Parkland does. I think Parkland has some say in like the property taxes. That's a very good question about who has the say for like generating more taxes, I guess, as it were. I don't know. They definitely have. I would assume they have a very strong say in how that money is spent.
Yes, I would think so.
But I don't think they have a lot of say in increasing that.
The Champaign Park Commissioner, is there an issue there, or is that just a matter of finding a competent candidate?
That one's interesting because it's Tim McMahon versus Deshaun Williams. Tim McMahon has already been on the park commissioner, so he's the incumbent. Deshaun Williams is the one challenging him. Tim McMahon makes it a very strong point to let it be known that he is a conservative. He has conservative values. All these races are nonpartisan, but different people have different slants. Deshaun Williams, he speaks to like communities of color, but yeah, I don't know if there's a lot of real hot issues for the park district.
How about Urbana? Does the school board in Urbana have? There are only two candidates apparently for.
Urbana school board.
That's wrong. They're divided into sub-districts, right?
Yeah, because for Champaign and for most places, the school board is voted on at large in the city. So, like for Champaign, there's like 3 seats and like 8 candidates for those 3 seats. But in Urbana, they make it into sub-districts. They have like 8 sub-districts or something in Urbana. Which goes to the interesting thing about Champaign and Urbana, where you have like very different ways that politics operate in Champaign versus Urbana, and it's just really interesting to see how the two compare. Because Urbana tried to do this to get more representation in specific neighborhoods or specific areas of Urbana, because they figured at large you might just have like the wealthier candidates or the establishment candidates just getting reelected. The downside with doing the sub-districts is that you get more people being uncontested.
Yes. Which apparently several are this year.
Yeah, there's one sub-district that has just one person running for it. I don't know if it's just 3 of the sub-districts, because they vote in some years and not others.
Your list here has 2 sub-districts with 2 candidates, and only 2.
And those are the only contested ones this election. So one of them is like in the like Sunnycrest type area, I want to say. Kind of like South Urbana, and then the other one is like kind of really central Urbana. I want to say, kind of like where Carl Hospital is, like in that area. So those are kind of like where the 2 districts are.
Personalities or issues?
The big thing in Urbana is again the discipline thing. That's like a very contested issue because I think, and I wish I was like more well versed on this, but this goes to talk about how little people tend to know about local politics in general. But if I'm not mistaken, Urbana recently changed the way that they do that whole discipline cycle, and that's been very contentious because some people are like, well, you're making the school more dangerous. Other people are like, it's a complex change. It's going to take time. So the candidates have different views on that.
Once again, your excellent website here has the videos from the candidate forums in Urbana, and people can actually, just through your website, this is votechampaign.org, find those candidate statements from those
Yeah,
meetings, eh?
and often that's, and at least in my opinion, that's one of the best ways to get to know the candidates is to hear it from their own mouths.
Okay.
And I love the candidate forums that the League of Women Voters puts on because they invite all the candidates there, and you can hear directly about the issues and how they answer the questions, and you can just
Interesting.
you can tell so much by the way they answer some of the things.
And it's the League of Women Voters that puts together these forums.
Yep, they do it in conjunction with like the News Gazette and the NAACP, but the League of Voters is really the ones that put in the legwork to get the forms done and put them on.
There are other, on this same web page that we've been talking about, there are other districts, other areas in which actual elections are going on. Mahomet Seymour, Rantoul.
Yeah, Rantoul's pretty interesting because there's a lot of elections going on in Rantoul that are contested. There's two different categories for village trustee. There's a 4-year term and a 2-year term. Both of those are contested. And there's also two different school districts.
Wow.
They break up their school districts into high school and I think like just middle school and elementary. So both of those school districts are contested.
Why is Rantoul a hotbed of local politics?
I mean, there's a lot of people that live in Rantoul, and I think just in general, nationally, people are just getting a lot more awake of politics. I mean, that's one of the best things that Trump has done, is making people aware that politics matter, that elections matter, that elections have results, and that when people don't participate in elections, you get results that you might not want. And so I think 2016 was a massive wake up for a lot of people that were on the edge of politics, or they liked following politics, they liked reading the headlines, they liked talking about it with their friends. But then after 2016, I feel like that there was a huge awakening of people that really wanted to partake in politics.
That's very interesting indeed.
Yeah, and you see that with, like I said, this last election, the November election in our city was like beyond historic. We had 25,000 more ballots cast than ever before in midterm. And
we have Donald Trump to thank for that, huh?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really no joke. I mean, that's one of the best things Donald Trump.
For or against.
Yeah, exactly. Donald Trump's done terrible things in so many directions. But the best thing is that he's got a lot more people aware and a lot more people wanting to participate. And like
fascinating.
For the city council race, you have 8 people for 3 seats. Like I think that's pretty unheard of too. Like to have that many candidates competing for something on a local level. So I think people are eager to get more tuned into that. I mean, that's a big thing that we try to do with votechampaign.org is to provide that info on these local elections that often have very low coverage. And I don't know.
You've been listening to James Manrique talk about the local election situation. His group, votechampaign.org, a nonpartisan group, provides information on these upcoming elections which you can vote in already by mail ballot, apparently.
And or in person. You can vote at the Brookins Center right now. Early voting.
Oh, yes, I see.
And then they're extending the early voting locations on the 25th. They will then be available in 7 locations. And no matter where you live, you can vote in one of those 7 locations. Like you said, vote by mail ballots are still available. You can still request them. You can still get them. So you don't even have to leave the house to vote anymore.
Do you think that's a good idea to have all these options about voting rather than to have an election day when you go to the polls? I mean, I wonder, frankly. Or maybe I'm just old-fashioned. But
it depends on turnout, because if you look at turnout across the world, turnout's the highest when it's like easiest to vote. Or, well,
that makes sense.
I kind of judge it on Australia has compulsory turnout, where you're required to vote in Australia. Right. And a lot of people... There's been a lot of mainstream media in our country that has turned people off from that. I feel like the establishment really discourages, because they don't want more people voting. They want less people voting.
Yes, exactly.
In Australia, you have compulsory voting where you're required to vote or else you get a very small fine. It's like 20 or $50. And you have like 92% turnout in Australia.
But under the Australian system, you can go to the poll, take a ballot, and basically
Exactly. You can
ignore the ballot. But I mean,
yeah, you can just
draw a
turn in a
picture on
blank
it or
ballot.
something.
So
yeah.
that's one of the reasons why, like the mainstream media in our country has really demonized compulsory voting for no reason. Because if you don't want to vote for any of the politicians in Australia, you can cast a blank ballot.
Yes.
Nobody's saying like, oh, you have to vote for A or B.
Exactly.
You can leave it totally blank. There's nothing wrong. They're just saying you have to show up. You have to participate a little bit, and you get 92% turnout and. You get some people that turn in blank ballots, but the blank ballots is still only like 5% or something of that. So, and then you can compare it also. Another way that I compare turnout is with Oregon. Oregon has vote by mail for the whole state, where that's the main. It's basically the only way that you vote in Oregon is that everybody just automatically gets a ballot in the mail, and then you can either turn it in at a library or a post office or a city building, or you can submit it through the mail. And Oregon has like voter turnout of like 86%.
I get my ballot in the mail in Oregon, I fill it out and send it in. Do I have to? I don't have to have it notarized or anything, so that people know what it. I mean, kind of
You have
just
to sign it.
why can't I fill out the ballot that comes in the mail to my household for my wife and my son and so forth and so on?
You could, and you could do that now with vote by mail ballots. So,
I see.
So I guess there are flaws with every voting system, but if you're trying to increase voter turnout, then that's one of the best ways to do it. And then I think in Oregon, I think you have to sign it, so they could compare signatures or that sort of thing.
Interesting. With all the, it seems to me, foolish complaints being made about fake voters from the last election. I'm not sure whether this system is actually helpful, except for those people who want to make speeches about fake votes.
Yeah, I mean, and that's definitely a thing that some people are concerned about is like non-citizens voting.
Right,
Because like some states you only need like a driver's license or something, and
Yes.
then some states have been making it easier for non-citizens to get a driver's license, which is great. But then it makes the complications with the whole voting thing, and I don't know. I think the answer to all that is just make it easier to have people to become citizens. Make them taxpayers, get them on the rolls,
that
and
certainly
get them
makes
paying
sense,
the same taxes
right?
everyone else does. So.
And I've thought for a long time that we just need a national system of identification. I mean, I know there's a lot of scare talk about having a national, but it seems to me that if you're born in this country and you're assigned a Social Security number or its equivalent as an infant, and you can testify
Like we're
to that.
basically already there,
Exactly.
so why not just make it more official?
Precisely.
Yeah, like you said, there's pros and cons on both ends because there's that whole thing about Big Brother having the government have too much info, but like you said, we already got the Social Security cards, so
Exactly.
I mean,
of all things to worry about.
why not just go for it? I guess. Or
Would you like to finish up by saying a word? Well, first of all, is there anything more that we should say about the local election, and then maybe a word about ranked choice voting, if you have, if you're willing?
sure, for the local election, one candidate that I didn't mention for the city council is Patsy Petrie.
Oh,
She's
yes.
another one on the city council.
Right.
She was on the county board for a while. She has a lot of historical knowledge on the county. She's lived in Champaign County like pretty much all of her life. So she has a tremendous amount of knowledge for local politics. So I just wanted to give her a shout out too. Cause
She's not presently on the city council.
correct. She's not currently on the city council or the county board, but she's running for the city
I see.
council.
Okay.
And she just has, I like that she has a lot of knowledge about like local politics and everything. So
Good.
there's just a wide variety of good candidates out there, and I definitely recommend that people do their research on those candidates. Like I say, the video forums are one of the best ways, but we also have the questionnaires so that if you don't have time to listen to them, you can just read what they say.
Okay.
But yeah, you said something about ranked choice voting? Or?
Sure.
Oh, I also advocate for ranked choice voting. I know, I don't know how many people will see this Tuesday, but Wednesday morning at noon, there's going to be a meeting for the League of Women Voters, and one of my friends, Ben Chapman, he's going to talk about ranked choice voting at that meeting. He's been working on that locally. I think ranked choice voting helps a lot more on the state level than necessarily the local level.
All right.
But I think it's a good way to fix a lot of issues with politics. It guarantees, like, ranked choice voting doesn't necessarily work in these local elections where you like vote for multiple candidates. Ranked choice voting works best when you're voting for just one candidate out of a bunch. But with ranked choice voting, it guarantees that the one candidate that wins the seat has at least majority support. instead of having what they call plurality
Yes.
support, where they just have the biggest chunk of
Right.
3,
Right.
5, 10 people.
Now, this system is actually in use in some places in the United States at the state level, right?
Yeah, I
Maine,
think
is
it's
it?
Maine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
uh-huh.
Maine has it on the state level, and then not Arizona. I think there's parts of Arizona that have it.
I thought I'd heard something of that
Because
too.
I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure I've seen a video out of Arizona where the candidates were talking about it.
And no judgment on how it's worked. I mean, there was no information, not enough information yet to make a judgment on how it's worked.
Kinda. I mean, in Maine, I think they flipped one of their seats with it. One of the seats got determined by the ranked choice voting method. The person that got the plurality did not end up winning the seat. So
I
that
see.
was like one of the first elections that ever used it. Was decided because of that system.
Maine had one of the worst governors in the country for a while there. I don't think that was, but I don't think that was the result of ranked choice voting. I mean,
Probably not.
but I think it's election for a successor, as you're talking about here in terms
Yeah.
of the.
Well, I think the one that was flipped was like a House seat or a Congress seat.
Oh, I see.
But it was definitely like the conservative had the plurality, but then once they eliminated the independent candidates, then the Democrat had the majority. And then in Arizona, basically any candidates that have gone through the system tend to agree that that it's better for campaigning because campaigning tends to be more positive instead of being attacking, because
see.
it encourages politicians to make alliances and say, I know you might already have your number one candidate picked, like you already, really like this person. But for number two, would you consider me because I agree with this person on X, Y, and Z, and I also have this new idea as well to add on to it. So
What an interesting point. So it may actually, you'll cast a ballot that has more to do with the issues than the personalities under ranked choice voting.
And that's exactly why the mainstream media does not want it, because then you get people voting on the actual issues rather than just the name or the person that's the most controversial. Because when you do the first past the post, when you have just the one person getting it based on the plurality, a lot of times it's the most controversial candidate that can generate the most exposure
Pro and con,
or
right? Yes.
just the most support, just because of the laws of just being confrontational or just being contentious or whatever.
Well, James, come back and tell us about this some more. Appreciate very much the information on the Champaign, on the local elections. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're going to turn our attention to some of the peace questions that have arisen this week. Happy to have you stay around and comment if you like.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the events that has to do with peace demonstrations this week, two veterans, U.S. veterans, were arrested at Shannon Airport on St. Patrick's Day. They had found a way to celebrate St. Patrick's Day that seems to me to be important. They're in fact facing a court hearing, or they've appeared in court yesterday in Ireland. A group of 7 U.S. Veterans for Peace took part in the protest against the U.S. military base at Shannon Airport in Ireland on Sunday. They said they did it because they pointed out there are up to 1 million children who have died due to U.S.-led wars in the Middle East since 1991. An arresting statistic, certainly. Prior to this protest, an Omni Air International plane, international character, arrived at Shannon from a U.S. Air Force base in Alaska. Most likely on its way to the Middle East was up to 300 armed U.S. troops. We didn't hear about any of this in this country, I'm sure. But in any case, this was what was happening in Ireland. And these U.S. veterans entered the Shannon airfield for the purpose of inspecting and investigating this aircraft, which they believed to be carrying these American troops through Shannon Airport to the Middle East. Unclear where. The veterans were carrying a large banner that said, U.S. veterans say, respect Irish neutrality. U.S. war machine out of Shannon Airport, Veterans for Peace. The two peace activists walked across the airfield with the intent of inspecting transport plane for weapons or munitions before they were apprehended by airport security and the Gardaí. The Gardaí are the Irish police. They were detained and interviewed at Shannon and Garda Station until the end of the day. Then they were imprisoned for their court appearance, which occurred yesterday. I haven't heard the results of that court appearance, but I don't have any reason to believe that it's anything other than what you would expect. Meanwhile, other wars of the United States were being discussed by our officials, elected and not. Secretary of State Pompeo, predictably attacked the Senate's anti-war Yemen resolution. Like as many other statements about Yemen in the past, Pompeo's description of the conflict is extremely dishonest and amounts to little more than reciting pro-Saudi propaganda. He criticized the Senate's vote to cut off support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, saying the Trump administration fundamentally disagrees that it's the right way to improve this dire humanitarian crisis. It's bad enough that the Trump administration insists on illegally providing ongoing support to the Saudi coalition war on Yemen, but what makes Pompeo's defense unusually infuriating is the conceit that war supporters somehow have a moral high ground in this debate. He starts with two false statements. Quote, "We all want this war to end. We all want to improve the dire humanitarian situation," close quote. This is Secretary of State Pompeo lying blatantly about what this government is doing in regard to the war in Yemen. It isn't true that advocates for continued support of the war want it to end. If they did, they would not oppose every effort to rein in the Saudi coalition. There's no question at this point that they're determined to keep the war going as long as the Saudis and the Gulf states want it to go on, and all indication are that those governments intend to keep fighting as long as the U.S. gives them the assistance and the green light to do so. We can't pretend this isn't a U.S. war. By continuing to indulge the Saudis and Emiratis in their failed war, Pompeo and Trump are guaranteeing that the war won't end. Because of that, there is no realistic hope of significantly improving the humanitarian situation, because the war is what is driving the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the Saudi coalition bears most of the responsibility for causing that crisis. There's a further account of Secretary Pompeo's barefaced lies on the matter, which I'll put on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. There's a great deal more to be said about this, but for some relief, we can turn to something that's being said in the American press that's not outrageous, that is actually fairly reasonable. Representative Ilhan Omar had an op-ed in, of all places, the Washington Post on Sunday. Omar, a Democrat, represents Minnesota in the U.S. House of Representatives and has been excoriated for her comments about the involvement of the U.S. in the crimes of Israel. She writes on Sunday in the Washington Post, yes, the Washington Post, "Since I began my first term in Congress, I've sought to speak openly and honestly about the scale of the issues our country faces, whether it's ending the crippling burden of student debt, tackling the existential threat of climate change, or making sure no one in one of the richest countries in the world dies for lack of health care. As a survivor of war and a refugee, which Representative Omar is, I have also sought to have an honest conversation about U.S. foreign policy, militarism, and our role in the world. The question of how the United States engages in conflict abroad is deeply personal to me. I fled my home country of Somalia when I was 8 years old from a conflict that the United States later engaged in." She's being generous by saying that the U.S. was involved in it from early on. "I spent the next 4 years in a refugee camp in Kenya, where I experienced and witnessed unspeakable suffering from those who, like me, had lost everything because of war. I saw firsthand the devastating toll of war, and I dreamed of one day coming to the United States of America, a land that promised peace and opportunity regardless of one's faith or ethnicity. But I also saw how America's image in the world is undermined when we don't live up to those values." Once again, she's being gentle, obviously. "And I witnessed how our continuous involvement in foreign conflicts, even those undertaken with the best of intentions, can damage our own reputation abroad. I believe in an inclusive foreign policy, one that centers on human rights, justice, and peace as the pillars of America's engagement in the world, one that brings our troops home and truly makes military action a last resort. This is a vision that centers on the experiences of the people directly affected by conflict, that takes into account the long-term effects of U.S. engagement in war, and that is sincere about our values, regardless of short-term political convenience. This means reorienting our foreign affairs to focus on diplomacy and economic and cultural engagement. At a time when we spend more on our military than the next 7 countries combined, our global armed presence is often the most immediate contact people in the developing world have with the United States. National security experts across the political spectrum agree that we don't need nearly 800 military bases outside the United States. Once again, some would say that that's an underestimate. Valuing human rights also means applying the same standards to our friends and our enemies. We do not have the credibility to support those fighting for human rights in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua if we do not also support those fighting for human rights in Honduras, Guatemala, and Brazil. We might, once again, argue about this description, but she's interpreting in what debaters call in meliorum partem, that is, putting the best face on the matter of the positions that she's arguing against. Our criticisms of oppression and regional instability caused by Iran are not legitimate if we do not hold Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain to the same standards. And we cannot continue to turn a blind eye to repression in Saudi Arabia, a country that's consistently ranked among the worst of the worst human rights offenders, whether it is the murder of dissenters such as Yamal Khashoggi or war crimes against civilian populations in Yemen. We must hold all of our allies to the same international standards as our enemies. This vision also applies to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. U.S. support for Israel has a long history. The founding of Israel 70 years ago was built on the Jewish people's connection to their historic homeland, as well as the urgency of establishing a nation in the wake of the horror of the Holocaust and the centuries of anti-Semitic oppression leading up to it. Many of the founders of Israel were themselves refugees who survived the indescribable horrors. We must acknowledge that this is also the historical homeland of Palestinians. And without a state, the Palestinian people live in a state of permanent refugeehood and displacement. This too is a refugee crisis, and they too deserve freedom and dignity. A balanced, inclusive approach to the conflict recognizes the shared desire for security and freedom of both peoples. I support, this is Representative Omar, I support a two-state solution with internationally recognized borders, which allows for both Israelis and Palestinians to have their own sanctuaries and self-determination. This has been official bipartisan U.S. policy across 2 decades, and has been supported by each of the most recent Israeli and Palestinian leaders, as well as the consensus of the Israeli security establishment. As Jim Mattis, who later was President Trump's defense secretary, said in 2011, the current situation between those two peoples is unsustainable. Working toward peace in the region also means holding everyone involved accountable for actions that undermine the path to peace. Because without justice, there can never be a lasting peace. When I criticize certain Israeli government actions in Gaza or settlements in the West Bank, is because I believe these actions not only threaten the possibility of peace in the region, they also threaten the United States' own national security interests. My goal in speaking out at all times has been to encourage both sides to move towards a peaceful two-state solution. We need to reinsert this call back into the public debate with urgency. Both parties must come to the table for a final peace deal. Violence will not bring us any closer to that day. Peace and respect for human rights, these are universal values. They are what drove Americans to organize and protest for equal rights and civil rights. They are what motivated nonviolent movements from South Africa to South Asia to the American South. These are the values that propelled me to get involved in public life, and I know they are the values that drove Minnesotans, she's representative from Minnesota, to give a Somali-American refugee, herself, a chance at representing them in Congress. Let us apply these universal values to all nations. Only then will our world achieve peace. It's quite a remarkable statement, I think, by Representative Omar of Minnesota. And of course, she's been excoriated for statements like that by the political establishment in the United States and the devastating and frequently false charge of anti-Semitism was, of course, immediately used against her, a shameful aspect of American political discussion. She establishes a standard that we should work for. You're watching We're on the Air. We're talking about war and peace in the American political system these days. And the area in which that is perhaps most salient right now is Latin America, and specifically the case of Venezuela. The former presidential candidate Ron Paul made a statement this week that cuts through a good bit of the nonsense we're hearing from the administration and even from the administration's critics on Venezuela. He asks, is Trump really about to attack Venezuela? Last week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ordered the last of the U.S. diplomats out of Venezuela, saying their presence was a constraint on U.S. policy towards the country. Interesting way to put it, eh? The wording seemed intended to convey the idea that the U.S. is about to launch military action to place a Washington-backed, self-appointed politician to the presidency. Was it just bluster designed to intimidate? Or is the Trump administration really about to invade another country that has neither attacked nor threatened the United States? While U.S. administrations engaged in regime change have generally tried to mask their real intentions, this U.S.-backed coup is remarkable for how honest its backers are being. Not long ago, the National Security Advisor to the President, John Bolton, openly admitted that getting U.S. companies in control of Venezuelan oil was the administration's intent. Trump administration officials have gone so far as mocking the suffering of Venezuelans when a suspiciously timed nationwide power failure heightened citizens' misery. Most people believe that this was no accident and it was part of the CIA's carefully constructed bag of tricks. According to media reports, Vice President Mike Pence is angry with the Venezuela coup leader, Juan Guaido, because he promised the whole operation would be a cakewalk, just like the neocons promised us about Iraq. Guaido said hundreds of thousands of protesters would follow him to the Colombian border to liberate U.S. aid trucks just over the border, but no one showed up. So Pompeo and the neocons made up a lie that Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro's thugs burned the aid trucks to prevent the people from getting relief from their suffering. Even the pro-war New York Times finally admitted that the administration was lying. It was opposition protesters who burned the trucks. Was the U.S. behind the takedown of Venezuela's power grid? It would not be the first time the CIA pulled such a move, and U.S. officials are open about the U.S. goal of making life as miserable as possible for average Venezuelans in hopes that they overthrow their government. Congress has, to this point, been strongly in favor of President Trump's regime change policy for Venezuela. Sadly, even though our neocon foreign policy of interventionism has proven disastrous, from Iraq to Libya to Syria and elsewhere, both parties in Congress continue to act as if somehow, this time, they'll get it right. I have news for them. They won't. Even weak congressional efforts to remind the president that Congress must approve military action overseas sound like war cries. In Representative David N. Cicilline's, Democrat representative from Rhode Island, statement introducing his Prohibiting Unauthorized Military Action in Venezuela Act last week, he sounded more hawkish than John Bolton or Elliott Abrams. The statement makes all the arguments in favor of a U.S. military attack on Venezuela, and then, wink, wink, reminds the president he needs authorization beforehand. as if that's going to be a hard sell. So is President Trump about to attack Venezuela? At a recent U.S. House hearing, one of the expert witnesses testified that such an invasion would require between 100,000 and 150,000 U.S. troops, going up against maybe 3 times that number of Venezuelan troops in a country twice the size of Iraq, with a lot of jungle, all for a prize that has nothing to do with U.S. security, rather the bottom lines of U.S. oil corporations. If the president makes such a foolish move, he might find the current war cheerleaders in the Democrat Party changing their tune rather quickly. Let's hope Trump changes his tune and returns to his promises of no more regime change wars. This is Ron Paul talking about the threat of the administration to attack Venezuela militarily instead of just using sanctions, which themselves are an act of war, and sabotage, apparently, in order to produce a government that the U.S. likes in Venezuela. Their reference to the Representative Cicilline's resolution introduced this week is important, and I think Ron Paul's suggestion that it's a false flag operation itself is probably right. Nevertheless, the resolution does remind the president that military action without congressional approval is not possible and therefore perhaps should be supported. If you want to call our local representative, Rodney Davis, and tell Rodney that the Congress should not allow the president to take military action without following the law, and indeed the president should not take this military action at all, that would be worthwhile. You've been watching Aware on the Air. We have heard today about the local elections from James Manrique. Thank you, James, for being here. Appreciate
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl, for having me on.
Come back and talk about election to us again. We need it.
Maybe we can do a wrap-up after the election.
I would like that very much. We will definitely do that. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on March 19th in the 12th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. government aids the Saudis in their genocidal war in Yemen and the Israelis in their racist oppression of the Palestinian people. The Israeli government has murdered protesters at the fence with Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison camp. The U.S. supports that, primarily because Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier for the U.S. control of Middle East energy, gas, and oil, a weapon against U.S. economic rivals from Venezuela to China. Such outrages cannot be dismissed. It's something that only happens in the South. In the Illinois legislature, local Representative Carol Ammons refused to vote against using University of Illinois funds to support Israeli apartheid, something Ammons would never have done for South African apartheid. On this show, we concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scholarly, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democrat Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and the attacks on WikiLeaks. This is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.